And welcome in to this episode of KOIN Conversations. I'm Travis Tyke, morning anchor at KOIN6 and co-host of the news and lifestyle show AM Extra on Portland CW. Looking forward to this conversation here today. It's a cause that's near and dear to my heart and so many across the Portland Metro, and one I think a lot of people can relate to. We're going to talk about the Dougy Center. It is a conversation that's going to be based around grief and grief resources and how this affects families and youth in our area. And we're going to dive into all of these resources with the executive director, Brennan Wood. Right now, Brennan, thank you so much for taking the time.
Happy to be here with you, Travis. Thank you so much for having me on.
Yeah, the Dougy Center is a fantastic resource for families and for kids who are going through the loss, the death of a loved one. I want you to take it away, though, for somebody who maybe they're tuning in, they've never heard of the Dougy Center. What is it?
Yeah, I'm happy to share a bit more. Dougy Center was started right here in Portland in 1982 on the premise of bringing kids together when they've experienced some of the hardest things that they may experience, the death of a parent, a primary caregiver, a sibling. For teens, it can be a best friend. Or really someone really close in their lives. We also provide support before a death when a family has a member that's been diagnosed with an advanced serious illness. And everything we do is meant to build community and resources around that experience for kids to create a safe space where kids can come together and share about what they're experiencing before and after a death and get support.
I mean, it's free support for these families, and that's what makes it so accessible for so many people. I want to dive in before we get further into the what Dougy Center is doing now. I kind of want to learn about how it started. This sounds like something that you would almost think like, of course, this is a resource. Of course, these families need help, but this is something that you could say is relatively recent in terms of the awareness of talking about grief. Tell us how the Dougy Center got its beginning.
Right. Yes. I think in a lot of ways it is new and we've also been in existence for 43 years.
Right.
I do think that there is more of a comfort level in talking about loss and grief in recent years, which I'm so glad to see. But we were started in 1982 here in Portland by a nurse named Bev Chappell. And Bev, who was our founder, she wasn't actively nursing. She had taken a break from nursing to care for her young children. Her husband was a pediatrician, and she was very interested in end of life issues and end of life care. And when she was nursing, she often saw that kids, when hard things were happening in families, whatever that looked like, kids were often not being talked to, being held at bay, so to speak, and really not informed or integrated into some of these really traumatic, difficult things that were happening in families. And she took exception to that. She wanted to learn more about that, and she was doing some work in the field of end of life. She had taken some courses and workshops with a woman named Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who was really one of the pioneers of bringing the hospice movement to America. And when Bev learned that Dougy Turno, who Dougy Center is named after, was coming to Portland for treatment of an inoperable brain tumor, Elizabeth, who had connected with Dougy, connected Bev. And Bev went and met Dougy, welcomed his family, and what she saw in Dougy was this real thirst to want to talk about what he was going through.
Hmm.
He was up at OHSU and he would say things to the other kids in the hospital like, I feel like I'm dying. Do you think you're going to die? What do you think it's going to feel like when we die? He wanted to talk about it, and it made the adults around him very uncomfortable. But the kids also really wanted to talk about it. And what she learned from Dougy is that kids sometimes share the same language. When hard things are happening, it's actually best to bring kids together in a similar experience. She started Dougy Center in the family room of her home with four little boys who all had had a dad die. And what she saw is these boys come together. And then she also saw their moms come together to provide support to one another. And that was the beginning of Dougy Center. It quickly outgrew her family room. And we expanded, and we've really expanded ever since. And over the last 43 years, we've served over 65,000 kids, teens, young adults, and adult family members. after the death of someone close in their lives. We were given some national media exposure and people early on in Dougy Center's history, and people wanted to do what we were doing. So now we have trained, up to 10,000 people a year now. And there's over 500 programs across the country and around the world based on the Dougy Center model that was all started right here in Portland.
It's an unbelievable legacy that the Dougy Center's already begun to leave over its 4+ decade history,
Yeah.
and there's so many bright days in the future. I want to talk about what you're doing to help kids with the Dougy Center. What makes this model so innovative and so unique is at least especially at the time and what's continuing to play out now. You work with kids from ages 3 to 18, and of course
Mhm.
you're not putting 18-year-olds and 3-year-olds in the same room. Dive into what you're doing and how you're working with these kids to make this impact and to make this difference.
Absolutely, we're not. You're right. And Dougy Center it's a peer support model. So we bring kids together based on a few different criteria, based on their age, based on who died, and often even based on how they died, to give kids that experience, that feeling of normalcy, that they aren't the only kid in the world that this has happened to give them the opportunity to make connection and create community around shared experience. Um, so we have groups. Again, we start at age 3, we go to 18. And then while the kids are in their support group, the adult who brings them is invited to participate in their own support group as well. So we really provide support to the entire family. And then we do have a young adult program for people 19 to 25 and then 26 to 40. So we really serve a wide array of ages and experiences. Within that, we have specialized groups for families that after a suicide death, after a murder or a violent death, after a substance use death. Um, we have a long-term or chronic illness group, both for before a death, right? So our Pathways program is in advance of the death, supporting families with an advanced serious illness. And then we have for after a death when it's been a chronic or long-term illness, and then lots of other opportunities to bring kids and teens and young adults and their caregivers together based on that shared experience. I think, one of the most powerful things that we can provide for one another is understanding and community. And kids as young as 3 years old really do come together based on shared experience and offer that perspective to one another that they're not alone. They're not the only kid who's gone through this. I will share, and I know Travis, you and I have connected in the past. We both have some lived experience around this, and I came to Dougy Center in 1987 when I was 12 and my mom died, 5 years into Dougy Center's infancy. And I think the most powerful thing for me was being in a room of people who wanted to hold the space for my grief. So it was incredibly powerful for me to be in a room with kids who also had that same experience that I didn't know anyone outside of Dougy Center who had
Mm.
had a parent die, but also that there were these adults, Dougy Center staff person, as well as adult volunteers holding that space, not trying to fix it or cure it or make me happy, but really holding the space for the reality of my experience. And for me, that just made all the difference in the world.
Well, and that's a perfect segue to something that we're going to talk about later in the show too, which is the theme of your TEDx talk that you did earlier
Yes.
this year, which is grief is to feel, not fix. Which I want to save that conversation for the other side of the break because I think it's such a poignant topic and lens to look at grief through because the conversation is continuing to evolve and change, and I entirely agree. And I'm not an expert in the field like you are, but that conversation has changed in so many ways, and the tone of it has changed, and the resources have changed. You talk about the
Yeah.
Dougy Center itself. The correct me if I'm wrong, but the original facility is over on Southeast 52nd in
Hmm.
Portland there, by Foster. But that's not your only building even anymore. And you shared your story. I'll share a little bit of mine. Yeah, my dad died by suicide when I was 11 years old, and I did not know that my
Yeah.
mom had actually looked into the Dougy Center, which at the time only had the Southeast Portland location. I grew up in Dundee. My mom was
Mhm.
working in Beaverton. To create this massive trifecta geographically, it just wasn't going to work. But
Yeah.
maybe that wouldn't have been the case if you fast forward to today, because you do have other resources and other buildings across the area. I'd love for you to speak to that.
Absolutely. I'd love to share a bit more about that. So, we do try as much as possible to reach kids and families where they're at. So, we do have our main headquarters in Southeast Portland, and then we have two different satellite locations that we're operating out of in partnership with others. So, we have a partnership in Canby. We call our partnership in Canby Walker's House, and or Dougy Center South, and that is a partnership with the Canby School District. And so our services are headquartered in Ackerman, their Ackerman Center in Canby. And then we also have a partnership on the west side in Beaverton with B4 Church. And that's been wonderful. We have, I believe it's something like 12 groups operating out of Beaverton on through that partnership.
Hmm.
And what I will say also, Travis, is, unfortunately, in the history of Dougy Center, we've never had a time where we haven't had a wait for our services. And we continue to grow at a steady and thoughtful rate and a high rate of growth. And it's just almost impossible right now to keep up with that growth without a lot of resources and support. So we are actively working on a plan to be able to tremendously increase the amount of services that we're providing so that kids aren't waiting, not as many kids are waiting, and they certainly aren't waiting as long. So that's in the works now, and we're really working hard behind the scenes to address that so that kids don't have to travel all the way across town because when tough times are happening, sometimes 14 miles might as well be a million, right?
Yeah.
And we do unfortunately have the highest need for our services that we've ever seen. We are serving more kids than we've ever served, and this fall our wait list was higher than it's ever been. We were able in October to start 6 new groups, and so that helped a little bit, but it's really almost a drop in the bucket of what we need. So we're working hard on that, and of course, community support for our services that are always provided free of charge to our families is the number one factor in us being able to serve more kids and families and get kids off that wait list more quickly.
What does that community support look like? I know there's maybe the most obvious way, at least in my case. And again, every time we talk, Brennan, I always try to say, wave my flag of transparency. I'm a volunteer at the Dougy Center. It's a cause that I am passionate about. I volunteer with a littles group, 3 to 6 year olds, and eventually I want to talk about, volunteering there too, so we
Mm-hmm.
can kind of buck some of the myths, or the fears that people may have about being a
Right.
volunteer there. But also, there are other ways to help, and this day and age, I would imagine, financial donations likely go a long way too.
They sure do.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would say in this moment in time, contributing directly to our services through a financial donation is the number one way that people can support, followed or closely tied with volunteerism, of course. And also, we recognize time. Time is very valuable.
Yeah.
So both of those things are incredibly valuable to us. Of course, we also always have a need for more tangible items. Right now, we are really trying to help provide nourishing snacks
Mm.
to all of our groups and making sure that in this time that folks are well fed and all of those things. So that's another need. We always have various needs, and you can hop on our website and check out our wish list and those kinds of things. But certainly donations go so far because donations for us enable us to have master's level support staff that provide our groups. All of our groups are run by a Dougy Center staff person who has at least a master's level education in a social service field. So it provides more opportunity for us to hire more folks, to add more groups and serve more kids. It also enables us to train more volunteers. And so that is really a high priority, and certainly volunteerism, which we can talk more about. and
Yeah.
and just thank you for your volunteerism. It's
Oh,
so critical to the success of our program to have
it's
volunteers.
It's so fulfilling, and I will always say this too about any volunteer mission that anybody has. There's always a selfish benefit out of it too, right? You always feel good too, being a part of a cause that feels bigger than yourself. So I just urge anybody that's ever thought about it to really give it a second thought or a second chance. I want to use what you just said as a segue into volunteerism at the Dougy Center, because one of
Mhm.
the questions that I had, or what was a
Mhm.
potential obstacle for me before I reached out to volunteer, was, can I really volunteer? Am I qualified to volunteer in a world that is revolved around grief? I'm not a counselor. I'm not a therapist. I don't have a socials degree of any kind. I don't have a master.
Right.
So how can I actually help? And you answered part of that with, you have those people on staff, but you go through a weekend of training to prepare yourself as well. I'd love for you to speak to anybody who may have a concern about volunteering at the Dougy Center.
Absolutely. I'd love to because I think that there is some common misconceptions about what it feels like to volunteer at Dougy Center. And certainly I get that as well. Just being on staff, people will say like, oh, isn't that so sad? Or isn't that so hard? And certainly, yes, what we deal with is big. It's a big emotional topic. It's a life-changing event for our families.
Right.
And one of the things that I think people forget or don't understand, I guess I should say, is how much laughter and community and support and joy actually happens at Dougy Center. So, in order to volunteer, you do not need a background in anything specific. You need to be willing to come and train on our model. We train all of our volunteers, and it is over the course of a weekend. Um, and then really be willing to be present. And we do of course have folks who maybe have a background in mental health come and volunteer, and they will say it's actually quite different than what they do professionally, because what we're here to do, again, is not to fix people's pain or to take it away, but provide this safe container where we're providing opportunities and outlets for kids to express themselves in whatever way works best for them. And sometimes that really looks a lot like play. That looks like opening circle where we share our stories, closing circle where we do a candle lighting, often in memory of the people in our lives who've
Mm.
died. But also in between that time, there's this opportunity for kids to express themselves through art, through theater, through music, through big energy play. And we need dedicated adult volunteers to be there and hold that space. We do a lot of what we call reflection at Dougy Center, where we're actually reflecting back to the kids what we're hearing and seeing. Not to not to fix it, but to say we see you, we hear what you just said to us, we're validating that experience. And often what reflection does is it lets kids know that it's safe to share more. So a kid may come into our program and say, talk about their parent who died, and what we're going to do is just reflect back to them what we're hearing,
Mm.
often reflect back to them even in the same tone or in the same energy level, to really make sure that they feel seen and validated. And often when that happens, a kid will say yes, and
Yeah.
right, they'll offer more because they're feeling heard, they're feeling understood.
That's the
And
that's the key word, and I was gonna ask you about that. It's just that there's this feeling of being understood that I think is so powerful.
I agree. And I think that we do that in so many ways at Dougy Center. The other thing that I think is interesting, I had this wonderful, powerful conversation with one kid in our program one time, and his family had agreed to be one of our kind of our families. We were sharing their story publicly. Obviously, we honor confidentiality and
Yeah.
we're very careful about what we share. But this family really wanted, after 3 years of coming to Dougy Center, they really wanted to give back and they wanted to share their story publicly. And I was talking to him, and he was such a thoughtful kid. He was around 10 years old, and he'd been coming for 3 years. And I said to him, I said, you've been coming to Dougy Center for a long time. You've talked to me about your friends and you play sports, and why do you keep coming back? What keeps you coming back to Dougy Center? And he was very thoughtful, and he gave it a moment, and he said, I think when I'm playing sports or playing with my friends, not all of them know at this point that my dad even has died. Some of them know, but I don't know which ones know. Some of them know how he died, and that was a big deal. It was a pretty traumatic experience for the entire family. And he said, and I get to come to Dougy Center, and I'm hanging out with friends. I get to shoot hoops. I get to do all these other fun activities. And I know that every kid here knows that my dad died. They know how my dad died. And for that time, I just get to feel normal. I don't feel awkward like I feel when I'm hanging out with my friends. And what a beautiful, beautiful way to share a lot of what we do. And volunteers really hold that space. They're there in it with our kids. And
Yeah.
yes, we have master's level folks here to run the group. They're always on site. They're always a part of it, so that our volunteers know that should something come up that's a little harder to manage, that they have that backup. But ultimately, it's a beautiful way to be in community and be of support to kids and families who are grieving.
It's a perfect story to encapsulate that feeling, both on both ends of not just for the Dougy Center, but for a child going through that loss.
Yeah.
And I speaking to my own experience. I was an early preteen as an 11-year-old, and
Yeah.
you know it, it's hard to explain when you feel like you're the only kid going through not just the loss of a parent, but one that there's a stigma around suicide, and
Absolutely.
you absolutely. I just want for everybody that hasn't gone through that experience to know that kids do feel that and they do sense that, and that's where the Dougy
Yes.
Center can step in. We have to take a quick break, but this is a good place to jump off to, because again, Brendan, I want to talk about your TEDx talk that you did earlier this year, and your theme with this was grief is to feel, not fix, and I think this is a perfect place to jump off into that conversation. So that piece is coming up after this break. Welcome back to KOIN Conversations as we continue on with these conversations with the executive director of the Dougy Center. That would be Brennan Wood. Now, Brennan, I've been looking forward to talking about your TEDx talk, which you did earlier this year. Grief is to feel, not fix. I want to know what you mean by that and what the point of your talk was.
Absolutely. I think that we are existing in a world that often tries to find a cure for anything that's uncomfortable, or a fix for anything that's uncomfortable or hard. And I understand that. Often right now there seems to be a push to create a more medical model around grief, that's saying that there's a pathology, there's something wrong with you if you're grieving. And what we believe here at Dougy Center is that loss and grief is a natural, normal, healthy response to loss. That actually, as humans, that's what we do, is we grieve when we lose things we love. This is a natural, normal human process. And so when I was working on my TEDx talk, I really wanted to focus on the idea that we need to feel grief, and that it is this normal thing, and that it isn't to fix, and that if we can feel grief instead of fixing grief, that actually helps us and moves us forward in a more um, I don't I don't know the right word, but it moves us forward in a different way, on a
Mm,
different path. A lot of what I talked about was that for me, feeling my grief instead of fixing my grief means that I get to keep loving. I don't want to forget about my mom. I don't want to
right.
move on and always forget that I had this wonderful mother, right? I'm still in relationship with my mother, even though she hasn't been alive for 38 years now.
Mm,
And so I wanted to really offer an alternative to what I'm seeing and hearing a lot in the world, which is it's okay to grieve. It's okay to feel the feelings. It's okay to feel all the emotions surrounding grief, and that actually might be the healthiest path forward for all of us.
yeah, I think it makes a lot of sense, and it's a lifelong journey, right? Just to
Yes.
your point, it's not only is it not about fixing it, but somebody even asked me the other day, and I'm not an expert, and there are so many other people in this world who have suffered loss, right? And
Right.
sometimes the feelings of that just rear its head in moments you're not expecting. And it took me a long time to understand. I would get mad before.
Mm,
I was like, why?
mhm.
It's been, at this point, I'm 34. It's been
Yeah.
23 years. Why?
Yeah.
Why?
Hmm.
Um, but who cares? Like that's allowed to happen.
Yeah.
You just kind of have to give yourself, in my terms, give yourself a break, and then listening
Hmm.
to your talk just helps really put that in perspective. I thought it was beautifully done. I
Thank
do want to
you.
ask too. I want to pick your brain while we have a little bit of time left. Just what was it like? I mean, doing a TEDx talk is not something that you just do every weekend. What was this experience like?
No, it is not for the faint of heart. I think, having it predominantly, I mean, you memorized essentially, and my talk was about 15 minutes, I think 14, 15 minutes. So
Jeez.
it's not an easy task, but and my talk was at the Keller Auditorium in front of a sold out audience, and that's not something that I do every day by any stretch.
I would
But
imagine that's a place too that you've seen many shows. You're local, so to
right.
be on the
Oh,
stage would be different.
absolutely. Absolutely. It was kind of a surreal experience for sure. And the TEDx Portland folks do such a beautiful job. If you haven't been to a TEDx experience, you should go check it out. So many different talks, they just do a beautiful job. And I was grateful to be a part of it. I was super proud to be a part of it. And a, it was a feat to accomplish, I think, yeah. And I think to your point, Travis, I think that, these kinds of things, what my hope is that by talking about it in a public way on a big stage in front of a lot of folks, and now it being on YouTube and all of those things, that hopefully together these conversations that you and I are having will help people to feel when that grief comes up 24 years later, that that is normal, that's okay, and that is a part of being human, it's a part of being alive. Grief is messy because being a human is messy, right?
Yes.
That is something I shared in my TED talk, because that's true, and it's okay. And I think the more we accept that, and express that and help others to feel like that's normal, the better off we will all be.
Yeah, I couldn't possibly agree more. Congratulations on the TEDx talk. You're right. That is quite the feat. And for those of you at home, if you haven't seen it, go check it out on YouTube. It is so worth the watch. Brendan, thank you so much for your time and for all you do with the Dougy Center. It's an awesome organization. And again, if you're out there and you're thinking about a donation or volunteering your time, check out this conversation and this story on KOIN.com. We have all kinds of coverage with the Dougy Center. And I'm biased, but I will continue to push for what the Dougy Center is all about. Brendan, thank you.
Thank you, Travis.